There are a group of people who make a living, whether they're comedians, maybe they're on the radio, or some other venue, who specialize in trying to tick people off. That's what they do. They revel in making people mad. And they are in turn cheered on by those who want to laugh at people who are offended by them. So they're sometimes known as shock jocks, that on the radio at least. That's their job, is to shock people. Well, the words or the ideas that inflame an audience and make people angry, they vary greatly from place to place, and they're shifting constantly. An insult from yesterday might be, yesterday's insult that might start a fight could be normal conversation in the next generation. Today's innocuous term that you might use might be a grave insult in another era. If you think back to the changing sensibilities about these things, you might recall the controversy that entailed the release of Gone with the Wind in 1939. In 1939, Gone with the Wind caused a lot of stir because Rhett Butler dared to use a profanity in that movie. Of course, sensibilities change because, of course, you can get that on the network television left and right these days. That word gets thrown around like it's nothing. The ideas change over time. It also changes by place. If you go to England, most of the profanities in British culture are related to religious terms. They're using religious terms in a profane way. In the United States, we do something very different. We don't do that. We use terms related to sex as profanity. It's not unusual in history for people meeting a new culture. If you are a trader or an explorer or even a missionary, you go and you meet a new culture. You might offend that culture, even gravely offend them, with having no idea why or what you've done, what you've said, what you didn't do, because we just have different cultural norms. So as we're considering what it might be that would stir people up, that might offend people and really get them mad, let's look at our text today and we'll see what the word was that Paul used that turned the crowd that he was speaking to against him. So much so angry were they that they're going to want him dead. We'll look at Acts 22, 17 to 29, beginning with verses 17 and 18. It says this: "When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. 'Quick,' he said, 'leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me.'" If you'll recall what's going on in this passage, 2 weeks ago, we saw that Paul was in Jerusalem, and he was set upon by a mob that was accusing him of bringing a Gentile into the inner area of the temple. Last week, we looked at the beginning of Paul's defense before that mob, how he tried to explain to the mob his experience on the Damascus road, how he had gone from wanting to persecute Jesus to calling him Lord and Savior. And this week we're going to see the culmination, the finish of Paul's speech. So Paul begins this section of his speech by saying, "When I returned to Jerusalem," when he returned after his conversion experience on the way to Damascus. It was probably about 3 years after. He didn't go right back to Jerusalem. He spent some time studying the scriptures. He spent some time figuring out what he had come to understand about Jesus. Finally, he goes back to Jerusalem and he says, "I was praying at the temple," which is an interesting thing for Paul to be doing. Notice that Paul, even though he is now a follower of Jesus Christ, he is not condemning the temple. He is not avoiding the temple. He is still going to the temple, to the place where his ancestors have gone to pray and worship and sacrifice to the Lord. He is still respecting the religion of his forefathers, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not antagonistic toward it. He's being respectful. So he goes to the temple to pray. And we know from Isaiah 56:7 that Isaiah said, "For my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." And that, of course, is what the temple is supposed to have been. And we looked a few months ago at Jesus clearing the temple when they had turned the court of the Gentiles into a marketplace. That upset him greatly. Now Paul is praying in the temple, in that house that is supposed to be a place for all nations to pray to the Lord, and he has a vision. He has a trance. He sees the Lord. Notice he says, "I saw the Lord speaking to me." Already he refers to Jesus as the Lord. That's the reference of his shift. The name of Jesus was nothing to him before. Now it's the Lord. He saw the Lord speaking to him. And the message is, quick, you need to leave. It was Paul's intention to stay in Jerusalem. It was his intention to bring the gospel to his people. He thought, I am a former student of Gamaliel. I'm a man of reputation here. These are the people that will listen to me. These are the people that know me. Here is where I should be. It makes every sense. It's logical. And yet, God says to him, you need to leave. Because here, your life is in danger. Now, why else did he need to leave? Not just for personal safety. It's because it says here in the text, they will not accept your testimony. One of Paul's most vexing questions, one of the things he wrestled with the longest and had the most difficulty with was the question of why. Why did the people of Abraham, those who had the law, who had the prophets, why did they not, more of them, not accept Jesus? Very difficult question for him. Now, of course, he himself did not accept Jesus before he saw him face to face, but why more of his people did not accept Jesus, he really struggles with that. And it will be an ongoing issue for Paul. He's going to, just after this part of the narrative, set out into Gentile lands to share the gospel. And every time he goes, he's going to go to the synagogue first and share the gospel with the Jewish community there and have very little success. And then he will go out into the marketplace and crowds of Gentiles will believe. And that disparity, we saw that in Romans 10 this morning when we were reading that. That disparity between his success with the Gentiles and his failure with his own people will be very difficult for Paul. But he is told here that they will not accept your testimony. Now you might think, why wouldn't they accept the testimony of Paul? He's known to them. He has a reputation as someone who knows the scriptures. He has a reputation for being a zealous follower of the religion of Abraham. Why wouldn't they listen to him? He should be an ideal person because he can say to them, I was just like you until I saw the light. But why won't they listen to him? This is actually an interesting, ironic thing in the way we are emotionally. When someone who is just like us, who is part of our group, turns from that group, abandons that group, and does what we think is the opposite. They switch to a new group. We tend, because of our pride, we tend to hate that person. We tend to have emotional anger toward that person because they were like us and they left. Which means, in a sense, they think that we are mistaken in staying where we are. Whatever we still believe, whatever we're still a part of, because they left it, they become like a traitor. They become a Benedict Arnold. There's a reason why you know the name Benedict Arnold. He wasn't that famous as a general. How many other American Revolution generals can you name? And the first person to say Washington is winning because they got the one that everybody else knows. I could name a couple other, but I'm a history nerd. Most of you probably don't know another one except Benedict Arnold because he was a traitor, because he switched sides. If he had been a Tory from the beginning, had sided with the English from the beginning, he wouldn't be famous, right? But because he was on our side and then he joined their side, he's a villain. That's how they think of Paul in Jerusalem. He was like us, but he abandoned us, and so they hate him. But it's also what his testimony is about. Because if Paul had a different testimony on a different issue, maybe they would have listened to him. But his testimony is about me. It's about Jesus Christ. On a different issue, on a different topic, maybe he could have gotten people to listen to him. But about Jesus, no. They're not going to listen. Well, Paul's not going to accept that and just walk away. He's going to respond. Verses 19 and 20, here's Paul's response to his vision. Lord, I replied, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Paul's objection is, no, don't send me away because they know me. They know how zealous I was. They knew me when I was Saul of Tarsus. Now I am the Apostle Paul. They knew me then. They will listen. But it makes them less willing to listen to him, less willing to hear his testimony. He talks about his involvement with the death of Stephen. He calls Stephen a martyr. And that's a word that is fairly new in its usage in the New Testament. It's a Greek word. The Greek word, we're just saying it the same way. It's the Greek word martyr. It means a witness, someone who was a witness to something. And they started calling those who died for their faith witnesses because they bore witness to Jesus Christ and were killed for it. And they were known as the witnesses, the martyrs. By the 4th century, we begin to see in the church actual lists of martyrs, where the day on which they were martyred becomes commemorated as an anniversary. And that will pick up steam over time in the Middle Ages. So that becomes a big part of the celebrations of the church's liturgical year, will be to remember those who died as martyrs. Stephen was the first. Stephen was chosen by the church of Jerusalem, if you remember from the early part of the book of Acts, to be one of the 7 deacons who would assist the apostles by helping out the widows. The apostles had too much to do in terms of sharing the gospel, preaching and teaching, to also take care of the widows in the Jerusalem church. And so they chose 7 men to help oversee that distribution of food. Stephen was one of them. Stephen was later arrested by the Sanhedrin and put on trial for blasphemy. His defense before the Sanhedrin is a powerful testimony in the book of Acts. But when he said, towards the end of that testimony, "Look, I see Jesus in his heavenly glory at the right hand of the Father," they tore their clothes, they rushed him out of there into the street, picked up stones and killed him. Paul was there. Paul gave approval to that death. He says, they'll notice my zeal. They know how much I've changed. Won't that work? Won't that show them? But unfortunately, the answer is no. No, it won't. The reply of the Lord in verse 21. Then the Lord said to me, "Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles." I will send you far away. This was God's choice. Paul did not choose to leave his people and leave Jerusalem. He didn't want to. It was not where his heart was. Paul thought he could make a difference in Jerusalem, but God had a far different intention. Paul thought he could make a difference amongst his own people. God said, "I will send you, and you will change the world amongst many peoples." Not just your own people, but many different peoples in different lands will come to the Lord because of you. Paul said, but I have zeal, I have passion for my people. God said, I will use that somewhere else. It was God's choice to send Paul away. And we know that later on God would support and empower and provide for Paul on those journeys. Even though they were difficult, even though his life would be in danger, Paul was empowered by the Holy Spirit to take that message to the Gentiles. Now, you've heard the word Gentiles, you know what that means. The Gentiles are everyone who is not descended from Abraham. All of Abraham's descendants, all of Abraham's descendants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we're not talking about Ishmael. The people of Abraham are the Jewish people. The Gentiles are everybody else. For many of the Jewish people living in the first century, the term Gentile was synonymous with immoral or ungodly. They used it as a pejorative, as an insult. That was not an uncommon viewpoint in the ancient world. It's not an uncommon viewpoint to this day for groups of people to be treated that way. The Greeks had a term for everybody who was not part of the Greek culture. If you spoke the Greek language, you were civilized. If you did not speak the Greek language, you were a barbarian. You know that term, barbarian. Maybe you didn't know where it comes from. It's actually a Greek word, barbaros. A barbarian. It's poetic. It's onomatopoeia, which is a crappy word for a word that's supposed to sound like the word that you're using. If you can't say onomatopoeia, that doesn't sound fair. All right. Barbarian is the word the Greeks used because they said that's how those other people sound. Ba, 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 ba. Like in Charlie Brown, right? When the adults are speaking. Can't understand the word they're saying. That's how they thought all of the non-Greeks were. You just can't understand them. Their language is so uncouth. They're pathetic. The Jewish people in the first century had that same attitude about the Gentiles. And so Paul stands before this crowd, the crowd that previously wanted to kill him, who have up until this point been listening, and he says, God told me, go to the Gentiles. That's the word. Gentile was the fighting word. Let's see how they respond, verses 22 and 23. The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth of him, he's not fit to live. As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air. That was the word. They got mad real quick when Paul said the word Gentiles. Now, if they had given Paul a chance, if they had let him finish his story, they might have heard Paul say, yes, and when I went to the Gentiles, I went to the synagogues first. I kept trying to help my people, and I desired to see peace between Jews and Gentiles. I respected the Jerusalem church's leadership, James and the rest of the leaders of the Jerusalem church, and Peter. They didn't give him a chance to talk about his further efforts on behalf of his own people. When they heard that, they lost it. Why are they so upset? Why is the word Gentile, that I'm going to the Gentiles, why does that make them so mad? Two very important reasons. Number one, it implies that the Gentiles can approach God directly without Judaism. You see, the normal procedure in the first century would be for Gentiles who want to come to God, you come here, come to Jerusalem, take part in the conversion ceremonies, adopt Judaism, be circumcised, start following the Sabbath, start keeping kosher. You come here and do the stuff that you need to do to be like us. Paul said, I'm going to go to them. They don't have to come to us. I'm going to them. It implies they don't need you anymore. They are no longer going to be dependent upon the temple, upon Jerusalem. upon the priestly class. The class of priests in Jerusalem were in effect the gatekeepers for Gentiles coming to God. If you wanted to go to God as a Gentile, you had to go through one of them. Paul is doing an end around and saying they're not part of the plan anymore. They're not the ones through whom we approach God anymore. We can go directly to God because the Gentiles can go directly to God. They didn't like that. And secondly, if you don't have to go through Judaism anymore, then the special place of the Gentiles, the way in which of the Jewish people, the way that they were better and first and chosen and special, it's greatly diminished. All of a sudden we are equal. We're not so special anymore. We are not God's favored people anymore because of who we are. So at the same moment, Paul was in effect attacking the temple, the Jerusalem, the authority, the leadership, and also the special status of the people by simply saying that he would go to the Gentiles. They would have none of it. Notice their response: rid the earth of him, he's not fit to live. He previously said to this crowd that Jesus was the Messiah. I saw Jesus on the road to Damascus. He was in heaven. He spoke to me. When Stephen said that, they killed him. This crowd, a little bit more tolerant of Paul, they were hearing him out. They were listening as he claimed that Jesus was the Messiah. But the moment he said anything about the Gentiles, they went bonkers. They went nuts. They lost it. That was a bridge too far. That was the third rail. That was the thing you just don't say. There are words you just don't say in polite society, right? Things that you aren't supposed to say that would really get somebody upset in the right circumstances. Gentiles. Going to the Gentiles. That was enough. They lost it. And notice how they responded. Very dignified, right? No. They started shouting. They started throwing their cloaks off. They were flinging dust into the air. They were having a tantrum. They were having a fit. They were losing it. This is evidence to us that they are far too emotionally invested in their privilege as the chosen people. That idea is so important to them. They hold it so tight that any thought of sharing makes them lose it, makes them turn back into a mob, makes them give up a rational discussion, a healthy debate, a conversation. Forget it. We want him dead. That's a question for us before we go on. Is there an issue in your mind, a topic that is so dear to you that just talking about it with someone who disagrees, if someone mentions any other viewpoint on that, you're going to lose it. You're going to lose your cool. You're going to get upset. You're going to want to fight. Is there an issue that you're holding on to that tight? Because you shouldn't be. Self-control is a necessary Christian virtue. It is a cardinal Christian virtue. One of the foundations of our character as Christians is to be in control of ourselves. There should not be an issue that you cannot have a polite conversation with someone else about. But I bet for a lot of us there is. Don't know what that might be for you, but I know a lot of people that can't have polite conversations about a variety of issues. They just can't. They're too emotionally invested to remain rational, to be polite, to have a conversation. Verse 24, what happens next? The commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. It's no surprise that they brought him back into the barracks. Remember that he's out here because the commander was asked by Paul, can I defend myself? Can I talk to them? And that speech started well. They listened to him politely for a while, and now they've become a mob again, so he's taken him back inside. No sense of leaving him out here because they'll probably attack the soldiers to get at Paul. Just go inside, shut the door. Then the commander says, flog him. We need to find out what's going on. You might be thinking, whoa, that sounds harsh. The man, when he first found Paul was getting beat up. Then he gave a speech, and now you're going to flog him. That seems a little disproportionate. Perhaps the commander thinks that Paul did this on purpose. He probably does not speak Aramaic. He probably doesn't know what Paul said. And even if he did speak some Aramaic, he would have absolutely no idea what this Jewish theological controversy is about. So maybe he thinks Paul did it on purpose. He riled the crowd up. He insulted them on purpose. Just wanted to tick them off, and because he had soldiers standing in front of him. He thought he could get away with it. He wants to get to the bottom of it, so he's going to have Paul flogged. Verse 25 and 26. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." So they're stretching Paul out to flog him. I don't know if they've gotten to the point where they've removed his shirt, but if they have, they will have noticed Paul's been whipped before. Not flogged before, but whipped. 5 different times by Jewish authorities on his missionary travels. He was whipped 39 times. That's going to leave marks. 3 other times he was beaten with rods by Roman magistrates. They just gave him a good beating. But to be flogged is a whole other matter. The flogging is done with what's known as a flagellum. It's a long leather cord that has tied on the end either a bit of stone or bone or glass or something like that, and then it's used as a whip. So rather than just the tongs of the whip, you're getting that biting into the flesh. It is a brutal punishment, and one that often enough would be fatal. The shock and the blood loss would be enough to kill the person being flogged. You'll remember that Pilate had Jesus flogged. Pilate wanted to show the people that wanted Jesus dead that their bloodlust could be satisfied with a simple flogging. Let's flog him. That'll be brutal enough. They'll see how bad it is, and then they won't want him dead anymore. Of course, that didn't work. So they're getting ready to flog Paul, and he says to the centurion. Centurions were Roman professional army people in the Roman army that were professional soldiers. The name tells you how many people they're supposed to be in charge of. If you know your decimal system or your metric system, you'll know. They're supposed to be in charge of 100 legionnaires. Normally in the Roman army it was actually about 80, but call him a captain in today's army. He's an officer, someone with authority, someone with a bit of power. Paul says to this soldier, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen?" Now this is a rhetorical question because Paul knows the answer. It is absolutely in no way legal to flog a Roman citizen. You cannot torture Roman citizens in order to get information. Non-citizens, go right ahead. People who aren't Romans, if that's what you want to do to try to get them to tell the truth, they didn't have an issue. But a Roman citizen, never, under any circumstances, can they be tortured. So it is certainly not legal. And Paul says to him, "I'm a Roman citizen." And now this thing just got really messy for the commander. He has no idea what's going on. Why are these people upset? Why is a riot about to happen in the area that I'm in charge of? And now this Jewish fight that was just a squabble has involved a Roman citizen. It went from a disturbance to an incident. And it's about to become a major problem for him. Roman citizens were entitled to be charged formally. They were entitled to have a magistrate hear their case before they could be punished. If you violated the citizens' the rights of a Roman citizen, if you didn't charge them properly, if you didn't give them a fair trial, if you did anything that violated their rights, whether you're the magistrate or the person accusing them, whoever, if you were involved in violating their rights, guess what they did? Whatever the punishment was that you gave out, happens to you. So if Paul had been flogged in violation of the law, when it became known to someone higher up the chain in the Roman system, they would have had the centurion flogged. They would have had the guy holding the whip flogged. They would have probably had the commander flogged to show them you don't mess with Roman citizens. So is it any wonder that the centurion went and told the commander and said, hey, what are you going to do? Notice, not what are we going to do about him? It's what are you going to do? Trouble flows uphill in chain of command. It's not my problem anymore. This is for the commander to figure out. The centurion knows what he's doing. He's no fool. Not his decision. 27 to 29, we'll see the end of this. The commander went to Paul and asked, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? Yes, I am, he answered. Then the commander said, I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship. But I was born a citizen, Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized he'd put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. So the commander hurries over to Paul and says, are you a Roman citizen? To be a citizen of Rome was a highly prized thing. Only those of high social standing, the very upper crust of society, were Roman citizens, along with a select few people who had done extraordinary service to Rome. If you were a common person who did something amazing for the empire, some massive thing of service, they might grant you citizenship as a reward. And then there was another group of people. At this point in the first century, it was a small group of people who had purchased their citizenship. When the empire became more corrupt in the 3rd and the 4th century, more and more people were taking bribes to become citizens. Paul says, yes, I am. Now, there are papers that Paul would have had as a citizen that attested to his citizenship. But he would not have carried those around. Those would have been in wherever their family's home, wherever his people came from, probably in Tarsus, where all of their family's important documents. He would not carry them around with him. So you're wondering, perhaps, how do you know? How does anyone know someone's a Roman citizen? They don't look different than other people. They don't really dress different. Roman citizens, contrary to what you might see in the movies, don't walk around in togas all the time. All right, certainly not in Jerusalem. So how do they know that he's a Roman citizen? They're going to take him at his word for a very important reason. Obviously, if they assume he's not and he is, they're in trouble. But no one is going to pretend to be a Roman citizen who is not, because the penalty is draconian. If you pretend to be a Roman citizen, if you fake documents and they catch you, they're liable to put you to death for that. It could be a capital crime. So nobody walks around saying, oh yeah, I'm a Roman citizen. Not going to happen. So he takes him at his word. But the commander wants to know, how on earth did you become a citizen? I paid a great deal. The commander is one of those rare people who saved probably for his whole life to purchase his citizenship. Because he knows that if I do that, my children will be citizens. My grandchildren will be citizens. We will all be citizens. It is a huge thing. I would say it is more valuable than becoming an American citizen. And what are people willing to do to come to America to become a citizen? A great deal of things. So in our history, people have been willing to risk their lives to come here to become a citizen. To be a citizen of Rome was even more valuable because it was more rare. Paul says, not me. I was born a citizen. There's a story there that we don't have. We don't know if it was Paul's father, Paul's grandfather. Who was it that gained citizenship? It must have been some extraordinary thing that this Jewish man did for the Roman Empire in order to be granted citizenship. But Paul was born as a citizen. And once they realized that, they ran away. They withdrew immediately. You can see the guy holding the whip going, whoops, dropping it and running away. I'm not here. I was never here. Forget me. Right? He doesn't want any part of this. They are out of there. The commander himself is alarmed because he knows that this has gotten real bad real quick. How am I going to solve this? How am I going to fix this? It's going to be in his lap. He's the one that arrested Paul. He's the one that put Paul in chains, which was a violation of his rights. Not a big one, right? Because they didn't hurt him, but it was a violation because he hasn't been charged with a crime. He knows he's in trouble. He has no idea how to fix it. Next week we'll look at his attempt to solve this dilemma that has fallen into his lap, but it is a doozy. So what do we take from this text? Other than some interesting things about Roman citizenship, there are three things for us to learn from this. Number one, we need to understand the reality of the people who can't see the truth, people who will refuse to believe what the truth is. Paul was struggling with that. He thought that for sure they will listen. But it doesn't work that way. Logic, reason, apologetics, they're all important things of our testimony and the gospel. But in the end, they're not the thing that saves. It's only grace. It's only the calling of the Holy Spirit that overcomes the hardness of the hearts of man. And you know what? Sometimes when people refuse to accept the gospel, God says that we're going somewhere else. I'm taking my workers, my apostles, my prophets, my teachers, I'm taking them somewhere else. Because this people doesn't deserve them anymore. That was the harsh reality that Paul was dealing with. And it's one for us to remember as well, because we live in a land where the gospel is everywhere if you want it. But a lot of people will not accept it, and it's not a matter of us convincing them. It's a matter of the mercy and grace of God reaching them. Second truth for us is the danger inherent in thinking that you're a special person in God's sight, that you are chosen for who you are, that you are, as a people, so very special to God. That is an exceedingly dangerous thing, because it begins to make us think that there are people like us and there are people like them. And we are special. They are not. That's why God called us. That's why God saved us, because we're special. That is an exceedingly dangerous mentality. The one that the Jewish people in the first century struggled with mightily. That was infecting their minds in a grave way. And as a people who were born into the church, many of you were born into the church. Your parents, praise God, brought you to church and introduced you to the gospel. It is for us a danger that we could start to think that we were here for a special reason, when in reality, like everyone else, we are only here by the grace of God. And lastly, this ties into the first two. The commission of God, the call of God, is to go to all peoples. Not just the people like us, not just the people that we like, not just the people that are nice to us. All the world is the mission field. Everyone you meet is potentially someone for whom God has sent you to share the gospel. The disciples were sent into all the world. Paul was sent into all the world. And so